Has this ever happened to you? A man looks into your eyes, but you feel him looking through you, not at you, as if somewhere beneath the admiration, beneath the lust and longing, there is something else, something darker. Not just desire, but recognition, a haunting familiarity, as if your presence touched a wound he never dared to name. Because sometimes the most unforgettable woman in a man's life is not the one who gave him comfort, but the one who stirred his chaos, the one whose absence carved silence so loud it became scripture in his soul. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the part of the psyche that holds everything the ego refuses to accept. The shame, the hunger, the unlived truths. And when a man meets a woman who mirrors that part of himself, not with violence but with quiet radiance, he either runs or he awakens. She doesn't seduce in the usual ways. She reflects. She reflects the parts he thought he could bury, his yearning for control, his masked vulnerability, the rage beneath his calm. And in the silent mirror of her gaze, he sees not just her, but the pieces of himself that ache for redemption. Most men are not ready for that. They want affection, not reflection. They want compliance, not confrontation with their own abyss. But you, if you are the woman whose energy moves like prophecy, not performance, if your presence feels less like an offer and more like a mirror held to his concealed self, then know this: you are unforgettable not because of what you gave him, but because of what you revealed. To lose a woman like that is not just heartbreak, it is ego death. And ego death is how the masculine begins the climb toward God, because in losing her, he loses the illusion, the projection, the fantasy. She was never just her. She was the archetype, the anima, the sacred reflection of his soul's emptiest room. You see, the shadow doesn't always arrive as nightmare. Sometimes it wears red lips and soft defiance. Sometimes it shows up as the woman who doesn't beg to stay, the one who doesn't argue to be chosen, the one who lets him walk away, knowing that she was the confrontation he prayed for but didn't recognize. And when she's gone, he won't forget her. He will obsess, not because she wounded him, but because she revealed his wounds. Because she saw him entirely, without flattery, without masks, without games. And in that seeing, she became dangerous. That's why he regrets. That's why her absence was his awakening. Because now everything else feels quieter, less vibrant, less true. He remembers the conversations that cut too deep. He replays the moment she didn't chase when he expected her to. He revisits her silence because it echoes louder than any scream. And beneath it all, in the marrow of his spiritual ache, a question rises. A question that men only ask when the ego is finally fractured. Was she just a woman? Or was she a messenger? Carl Jung believed in symbols, in synchronicity, in sacred encounters that trigger the soul's unraveling. And whether or not he believed in God the way religions define him, he believed in the divine archetype, the deep, collective intelligence that speaks not in sermons, but in shadows. And that's what she was. A sacred interruption, a pause in the script he had written for himself. The script where he controlled the outcome, where he never had to be exposed. But her presence was not part of that script. She brought light, not the gentle kind, but the kind that burns. And when she left, she did not beg for closure. She did not soften her edges for the sake of his comfort. She left like a storm leaves the forest, with roots torn and skies cleared. And now he remembers her not as the one who loved him, but as the one who confronted him. He might scroll through photos, replay her voice, analyze old messages. But what he's really doing is wrestling with the shadow, trying to tame it, understand it, master it. But the shadow doesn't yield to control. It demands surrender. And if you are the woman who became that mirror, understand. You were never just his desire. You were his lesson, his reckoning. his invitation to finally meet himself. Not the man the world applauds, but the man the soul demands he become. And that is why he regrets. Not because he lost you, right, but because losing you shattered the version of himself that could no longer survive. He tries to bury her memory in distractions, in other bodies, in loud rooms, in long nights. But the shadow doesn't fade in noise. It waits in the silence. It grows in the quiet spaces between touch and truth, between what he reaches for and what he's actually missing. He doesn't miss her kindness, though it haunts him. He doesn't miss her beauty, though it lingers like incense on his senses. He misses the reflection of himself that only existed in her presence, the self he glimpsed but didn't have the courage to become. She was not a reward for his masculinity. She was a mirror of all its cracks, its posturing, its longing to be seen beneath the armor. And when a man is faced with that kind of woman, the kind who sees without flinching, who touches without owning, who leaves without punishing, it destabilizes the whole narrative he's built around power. Because true power isn't in domination. It's in devotion to what is real. And she was real in ways that frightened him. Carl Jung taught that every soul carries within it the tension between the persona, the mask we wear for the world, and the shadow. The truth we hide, even from ourselves. But what happens when a woman refuses to play to either? She neither coddles his persona nor fears his shadow. She moves like a mystery that cannot be named and that terrifies him. Because he can't possess her, not really. He can desire her, obsess over her, dream of her. But to possess her, he would have to meet her on the level of soul. And that is where most men tremble. She didn't demand his evolution, she simply didn't shrink to accommodate his refusal of it. And that quiet refusal, that dignified self-containment, broke him in ways that sermons never could. He didn't understand it then. But now, with time and solitude, the pieces return. Moments. Glances. That time she turned away, not in anger, but in knowing. That moment he raised his voice and she didn't fight. Not because she was weak, but because she refused to argue with a man who couldn't yet see himself. And slowly he realizes, her absence was not punishment, it was initiation. She withdrew not to wound him, but to allow the wound he refused to see to finally surface. Because in her presence he could still pretend. But in her absence he is left with truth. Jung would call it the integration of the shadow, the process of reclaiming those rejected aspects of the self. It doesn't happen through pleasure. It begins with pain, with confrontation, with the unsettling realization that the life we built to impress others is killing something sacred within. And that is what she sparked. So now he's different. He may not say it. He may not know how to name it. But he carries her with him, not in nostalgia, but in the slow, sacred undoing of everything false. She became the voice inside his silence, the stillness that judges his distractions, the echo that follows him into rooms where her energy never walked, but somehow still lingers. And yes, he wonders, did she love him? Did she ever ache like he now does? Did she feel this hollow bloom in her chest when he vanished, the way he does now in the dark? But those questions remain unanswered, because she was not a woman of easy answers. She was a question, a koan wrapped in grace and shadow, meant not to be solved, but to awaken. And whether or not she ever returns, her work is already done. He will never touch another without remembering how it felt to be held without being tamed. He will never kiss another without feeling the absence of her truth between their lips. He will never see another woman's fire without remembering the burn of hers, the kind that cauterized the falsehoods in his being. In losing her, he met himself. And that is the deepest kind of spiritual awakening. So when he lies awake long after the world has stopped demanding from him, when the lights are out and there is nothing left to prove, he will hear her name in the silence between his heartbeats, not because she belongs to him, but because once upon a time she was the shadow that looked like love, the woman who held a mirror to his soul and did not blink. There are women who dance around a man's edges, careful not to stir what sleeps inside him. And then there are women who, by simply existing, awaken the entire storm he spent his life suppressing. She was the latter, not by volume, not by demand, but by presence, by essence, by something he still cannot articulate, only feel. When Jung spoke of anima, he was describing more than the feminine within the man. He was describing the unconscious portal through which the masculine glimpses his soul. And sometimes that anima appears not in dreams, but in flesh. In a woman who feels like poetry long before she's ever touched. She becomes a mirror, not of what he is, but of what he could be if he shed the mask and faced the weight of his unlived life. That's what terrified him. Not her power, but his own power reflected in her eyes. A power he hadn't yet earned. A power that required surrender, not control. And so he retreated, into logic, into bravado, into the comfort of women who didn't challenge his soul, only stroked his ego. Because when a man has not yet integrated his shadow, he sees depth as danger. He mistakes stillness for boredom. He interprets silence as absence, not presence refined. And he chases chaos because it doesn't ask him to become anything more than what he already is. But she asked, not with words and with energy. She didn't need him to rise. She simply stood in her knowing, and that alone became a call to ascend. He failed that call, but the call didn't end when she walked away. That's what men don't understand until it's too late. The absence of a high-value woman doesn't create silence. It amplifies the noise inside him, and eventually that noise becomes unbearable. He starts questioning, why do other women feel flat? Why do conversations feel like performance? Why does intimacy feel more like distraction than connection? It's because once he's tasted soul, everything else tastes like sand. And this is where the real initiation begins. Not in her return, but in his reckoning. In the slow, brutal death of the illusions he once called identity. Because to become worthy of her, not to possess her, but to meet her, he must journey into himself. He must face the very parts of him that drove her away. The fear of vulnerability masked as detachment. The hunger for validation disguised as confidence. The avoidance of truth under the guise of logic. And this descent is the essence of shadow work. To strip away what he thought made him strong and meet the trembling boy beneath. To acknowledge that his pride was protection, his silence was fear, his charm was control. Only then does he begin to understand. She was never asking for perfection. She was inviting presence. Not a man who dominates the room, but one who can sit in the fire of her depth without flinching. Not a man who owns her, but one who honors the mystery she carries without needing to solve it. Not a man who runs, but one who roots. And now, in her absence, he becomes the student. Not of her, but of the self she revealed. Because that's the paradox of feminine power. It does not break him. It reveals where he was already broken, and dares him to rise from the rubble, not as an echo of who he was, but as the man he was always meant to become. She may never know the tears he hides in the stillness. She may never witness the sacred rage he now feels, not at her, but at the version of himself who couldn't hold her. But the shadow she awakened will not let him forget. Not because she is unforgettable, though she is, but because the soul does not forget the one who cracked it open. And in that awakening, in that painful, holy unraveling, he begins to pray. Not with words, not to some distant deity, but with action, with presence, with truth. He begins to believe in the divine, not because someone told him to, but because her memory feels like a sermon that never stops echoing. And maybe that is what Jung meant when he was asked, did Carl Jung believe in God? He replied, I don't believe, I know. Because once you've met a woman who carries the sacred in her stillness, you stop needing belief. You carry the knowing, in your bones, in your breath, in the ache she left behind. There comes a moment, not in youth, but in the weary aftermath of patterns repeated, where a man finds himself standing alone in the ruins of what his ego once called love. It's quiet here, too quiet. And in that silence, her absence isn't merely a void, it is an echo, a haunting reminder that intimacy without truth is just performance, that conquest without connection is a hollow crown. He sees her now not through memory but through contrast. The weightless conversations, the performative smiles, the women who give him everything but never touch the places she once reached with nothing but a glance. She wasn't louder. She wasn't more compliant. She wasn't available in the way others were, but she was present in a way none of them ever could be. She was the mirror that didn't flatter but revealed. And while others fed his pride, she pierced his soul. That's the tragedy of feminine power misunderstood. When a woman leads with essence, she does not seduce. She awakens. And when the masculine is unprepared for awakening, it recoils. It runs back into the arms of the shallow, not out of desire, but out of safety. She was not a phase. She was not a fling. She was the threshold he was too afraid to cross, because on the other side of her was himself. Carl Jung spoke of individuation, the painful process of becoming whole, of integrating the conscious with the unconscious, of embracing the shadow. And that's what she triggered. Not just desire, but disintegration. Not just romance, but revelation. He remembers now, years later, the stillness she carried like armor. The way she spoke with pauses, not to be mysterious, but because she needed no performance to hold space. He remembers how her eyes didn't just look at him, they read him. And he remembers how that terrified him. Because when a man has built his identity on masks, truth feels like violence. But it was never her love that hurt him. It was the truth her love revealed. In her silence, she said more than 1,000 women ever will with their attention. In her distance, she taught him the cost of not being present. And in her absence, she became the very reason he now questions everything he once believed about strength, about intimacy, about God. Because what is God if not the ultimate witness of your truth? And what is the feminine in her divinely awakened form, if not a glimpse of that same sacred gaze? She wasn't religion. She was revelation. She didn't preach. She pierced. She didn't save him. She showed him how lost he was. And now, with every meaningless encounter, every night spent in the arms of a woman whose name he forgets by morning, he remembers her. Not with nostalgia, but with reverence. Because she didn't just pass through his life. She changed its trajectory. She didn't love the man he pretended to be. She loved the man buried beneath the armor, the man he is only now becoming. That's the alchemy of absence. It burns away illusion. It exposes the false and exalts the real. And it teaches a man that the feminine is not something to possess, but to protect, to honor, to rise for. He thought she was a detour, but she was the destination. He thought he lost her, but he was the one who was lost. And her departure was the map. And now he walks, not to find her, but to find the man who can meet a woman like her and not flinch. The man who doesn't run from depth. The man who can sit in silence and still be heard. The man who doesn't conquer, he connects. He walks toward wholeness, toward his shadow, toward God, not the God of dogma, but the God that whispers through the soul of a woman who loved him in truth. He no longer asks, did Carl Jung believe in God? Because when he thinks of her, he knows. And so, when a man stares long enough into the silence her absence left behind, he does not merely mourn the loss of a woman. He mourns the loss of himself. The version of him that could have grown, softened, risen. Had he faced his shadow instead of projecting it? But that is the curse and blessing of the truly feminine presence. She awakens him by withdrawing. She becomes the mirror that forces him to see everything he has denied, the longing, the fragility, the terror of love's vulnerability. She becomes in absence more powerful than she ever was in presence, Because the woman who walks away with grace, who chooses peace over chaos, mystery over explanation, she doesn't disappear. She becomes a myth in his psyche, a holy wound wrapped in golden silence, the archetype of what was possible and what will never be again. That is the paradox of feminine power. She is soft enough to feel everything and strong enough to walk away from what does not serve her becoming. And when he finally looks back, decades later, through marriage, distraction, or spiritual pursuit, it won't be the women who stayed, begged, or blamed that echo in his soul. It will be the woman who vanished with dignity, leaving him to face the very shadow she once illuminated. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.